The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty New Mexico territory as Thomas Mackenzie guided his weathered wagon down the narrow canyon trail. The 24-year-old farmer had traveled far from his family's homestead in Kansas, carrying nothing but determination and a few precious seed packets in his worn leather satchel. His father's dying words echoed in his mind. "Find good land, Thomas. Make something of yourself where others fear to go." The year was 1878, and the Apache Wars had left most settlers terrified of venturing into this remote region. But Thomas had heard whispers in the trading posts about fertile valleys hidden deep in Apache territory, places where a man could grow crops that would feed families for generations. He knew the risks, but desperation had a way of making even the most dangerous paths seem reasonable. His wagon creaked and groaned as it navigated the rocky terrain. The horses snorted nervously, their ears constantly swiveling at every sound. Thomas had been riding for 3 days without seeing another soul, living on hardtack and stream water. The isolation was beginning to wear on him, but he pressed forward, trusting in the rough map an old prospector had sketched for him in exchange for a hot meal. As the sun reached its peak, Thomas noticed smoke rising from beyond a cluster of red rocks ahead. His heart hammered against his ribs. Smoke meant people, and in this territory, people could mean trouble. He considered turning back, but his supplies were running low, and his horses needed rest. Taking a deep breath, he decided to investigate cautiously. The trail curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly the landscape opened into a hidden valley that took his breath away. Green grass stretched as far as he could see, fed by a crystal-clear stream that wound through the center like a silver ribbon. Cottonwood trees provided shade along the banks, and wildflowers dotted the meadow in brilliant splashes of color. It was exactly what he had been searching for. But Thomas wasn't alone in the valley. 3 figures sat by a small fire near the stream, and as his wagon approached, they stood and turned toward him. His blood ran cold when he realized they were young Apache women, probably in their late teens. They wore traditional buckskin dresses decorated with intricate beadwork, and their long black hair gleamed in the sunlight. They watched him with curious eyes rather than fear or hostility. Thomas slowly brought his wagon to a stop about 50 feet away from their camp. His hand instinctively moved toward the rifle lying beside him on the wagon seat, but something in their demeanor made him pause. They weren't reaching for weapons or calling for help. Instead, they seemed genuinely interested in this unexpected visitor. The tallest of the 3 women stepped forward. She had striking features with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. She raised her hand in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture and spoke in accented but clear English. "You are lost, white man?" Thomas was surprised by her command of his language. He had expected to communicate through gestures if he encountered any Apache people. He climbed down from his wagon slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I'm looking for good farming land," he said honestly. "I heard there might be some in these parts." The 3 women exchanged glances and spoke rapidly in their native language. Thomas caught none of it, but their tone seemed more curious than threatening. The woman who had spoken first smiled slightly and took another step closer. "I am Ayana," she said, placing her hand on her chest. "These are my sisters, Kiona and Nayeli." The other 2 women nodded in acknowledgement. "We have never seen a white man come here alone before. Usually they come in large groups with many guns and much noise." Thomas introduced himself and explained his peaceful intentions. As they talked, he learned that the 3 sisters often came to this valley to gather plants and herbs for their people. Their grandfather had told them stories about white settlers, but they had never actually encountered one face to face. "You're the first white man we've ever met," said Kiona, the youngest of the 3, her eyes wide with fascination. The sisters were surprisingly welcoming, sharing their fire and offering him food from their supplies. Thomas contributed some of his own provisions, and they sat together eating and talking as the afternoon wore on. He learned that their band lived in the mountains several miles away, and that this valley was considered neutral, ground where different groups could come without conflict. Ayana explained that many of her people viewed all white settlers as enemies because of the violence and broken promises they had experienced. But her grandfather had also taught them that not all people were the same, regardless of the color of their skin. She said she wanted to judge Thomas by his actions rather than the actions of others who looked like him. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and orange. Thomas felt a peace he hadn't experienced since leaving Kansas. These 3 women had shown him more kindness in one afternoon than he had received from many white settlers during his long journey west. When it came time to make camp for the night, the sisters surprised him by offering to share their knowledge of the valley. They showed him which areas flooded during the spring rains and which spots had the richest soil. They pointed out edible plants and warned him about dangerous animals that occasionally passed through. That evening, as they sat around the fire under a canopy of brilliant stars, Thomas realized his life had taken an unexpected turn. He had come seeking land, but he had found something much more valuable: the possibility of friendship and understanding. In a place where such things seemed impossible, the 3 Apache sisters had challenged everything. He thought he knew about their people, just as he seemed to have challenged their preconceptions about white men. As the fire crackled and the night sounds of the valley surrounded them, Thomas wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether this chance encounter might change the course of his future in ways he never could have imagined. Dawn broke with a symphony of birdsong that Thomas had never heard before in his life. The valley seemed even more beautiful in the soft morning light, with mist rising from the stream and dewdrops sparkling on every blade of grass. He had slept surprisingly well despite being in unfamiliar territory. Perhaps because the 3 Apache sisters had taken turns keeping watch throughout the night. When he emerged from his bedroll, he found Ayanna already awake, preparing a breakfast of cornmeal cakes and wild berries. She smiled when she saw him and gestured for him to join her by the fire. "You slept peacefully," she observed. "That is good. It means the spirits of this valley have accepted you." Thomas wasn't sure he believed in such things, but he appreciated the sentiment. As they ate together, Kiona and Nayeli woke and joined them. The conversation flowed easily, with the sisters asking questions about his life in Kansas and his reasons for coming west. They seemed particularly interested in his farming knowledge and his plans for the valley. "My grandfather always said that the earth gives life to those who understand her," Nayeli said thoughtfully. He would be interested to meet someone who makes plants grow where they did not grow before. Thomas was intrigued. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Is he the leader of your band?" The sisters exchanged meaningful looks before Ayanna answered. "He is our medicine man and keeper of our stories. He is very old and has seen many changes in our land. Perhaps you should meet him." This suggestion caught Thomas off guard. Meeting more Apache people hadn't been part of his plan, and he wasn't sure how welcome a white stranger would be in their camp. But the sisters seemed genuinely eager to make this introduction, and Thomas found himself curious about their grandfather despite his apprehensions. After breakfast, the sisters offered to show Thomas more of the valley. They walked along the stream with Ayanna pointing out the subtle signs that indicated good farming soil. She demonstrated how her people had been cultivating certain areas for generations, growing corn, beans, and squash in the traditional manner. "We call them the 3 sisters," she explained, referring to the crops. "They grow together and help each other. The corn gives the beans a place to climb. The beans put strength back into the soil, and the squash keeps the weeds away with its big leaves." Thomas was impressed by this agricultural wisdom. He had never considered how different crops could work together in such a symbiotic relationship. The farming methods he had learned from his father seemed crude by comparison. As they explored, Kiona gathered various plants and herbs, explaining their uses for medicine and cooking. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of every plant in the valley, knowing which ones could heal wounds, which could ease pain, and which ones were dangerous to touch. Thomas realized that these women possessed a deep understanding of the land that went far beyond anything he had learned in Kansas. Around midday, the sisters made their decision. "We will take you to meet our grandfather," Ayanna announced. "But you must understand that this is not something we do lightly. Our people have reasons to distrust white men, and your safety cannot be guaranteed if others in our band do not accept you." Thomas weighed his options carefully. He could stay in the valley alone and try to start his farm, but he would be isolated and vulnerable. On the other hand, meeting with the Apache band could either lead to acceptance and peaceful coexistence, or it could end very badly for him. The sisters seemed to genuinely believe their grandfather would want to meet him, but they couldn't speak for the rest of their people. "I'll come with you," he decided, "but I want to bring gifts to show my peaceful intentions." The sisters approved of this idea and helped him select appropriate items from his wagon. They suggested tobacco, which was highly valued for ceremonies, and some of the metal tools he carried, which would be useful for everyday tasks. Thomas also decided to bring some of his precious seeds, thinking that a man who understood farming might appreciate them. After securing his wagon and horses in a hidden spot near the stream, Thomas followed the three sisters up a narrow trail that led into the mountains. The path was treacherous and barely visible to his untrained eye, but the women moved along it with the confidence of those who had walked it countless times. As they climbed higher, Thomas noticed signs of human presence. There were subtle markers along the trail, a pile of stones here, a bent branch there, that the sisters explained were messages left by scouts and hunters. The Apache people had developed an intricate communication system that allowed them to move through their territory while staying informed about potential dangers. Late in the afternoon, they reached a plateau where the Apache camp was situated. Thomas's first sight of the village took his breath away. About 30 traditional dwellings called wickiups were arranged in a rough circle, constructed from wooden frames covered with brush and hides. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and he could see people moving about their daily activities. The moment they entered the camp, however, all activity stopped. Men, women, and children turned to stare at the unexpected white visitor. Some of the warriors reached for their weapons, while others simply watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Thomas felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him and fought the urge to turn and run. Ayana spoke rapidly in Apache to several of the adults, gesturing toward Thomas and apparently explaining his presence. A heated discussion ensued, with voices raised in what seemed to be argument or debate. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. His arrival was causing significant controversy. An elderly man emerged from one of the larger wickiups, leaning heavily on a walking stick carved with intricate designs. His hair was white as snow, and deep lines mapped the history of his long life across his weathered face. Despite his apparent age, his dark eyes were sharp and alert as they fixed upon Thomas with an intensity that seemed to see straight into his soul. This had to be the grandfather the sisters had spoken about. Thomas waited respectfully as the old man approached, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether he would be accepted as a friend or rejected as an enemy. The entire camp had fallen silent, and even the wind seemed to pause as if waiting for what would happen next. The grandfather stopped directly in front of Thomas and studied him for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was strong despite his advanced age, and to Thomas's amazement, he spoke in perfect English. "So you are the white man who wishes to grow food in our sacred valley," the grandfather said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and wisdom. "I am Manuelito, keeper of our people's memories and guide to the spirit world. My granddaughters, tell me you are different from the soldiers and settlers who have brought only death to our lands." Thomas felt the intense scrutiny of the entire camp as he carefully considered his response. He could sense that his next words would determine not only his fate but possibly the nature of future relationships between his people and theirs. "Respected elder," Thomas began, "I came seeking land to farm, but I have found something much more valuable. Your granddaughters have shown me wisdom about the earth that I never knew existed. I wish to learn from your people, not take from them." Manuelito's weathered face remained impassive, but Thomas caught a flicker of interest in the old man's eyes. Several of the younger warriors shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with having a white man in their camp, but they remained silent out of respect for their elder. "Words are like leaves in the wind," Manuelito said. "They can sound beautiful, but they scatter easily. Tell me, young farmer, what do you know of the history between your people and mine?" Thomas swallowed hard. He had heard stories of conflicts and broken treaties, but he had never paid much attention to them. Now surrounded by people whose lives had been directly affected by those events, his ignorance felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. "I know there has been violence and betrayal," he admitted. "I know that promises have been made and broken, but I also know that I am just one man who wants to grow food and live in peace. I cannot change what others have done, but I can choose how I conduct myself." The grandfather nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something in him. "At least you speak honestly about your ignorance. Many white men come here claiming to understand us while knowing nothing of our suffering." He gestured for Thomas to follow him. Come. We will talk more privately. They walked to the edge of the camp where a small fire burned in front of a modest wickiup. Manuelito settled himself on a woven mat and indicated that Thomas should sit across from him. The three sisters had followed at a respectful distance and now sat nearby, clearly eager to hear what their grandfather would say. 40 years ago, when I was a young warrior, Manuelito began, I believed that white men and Apache could live side by side in peace. I had seen how the Spanish colonizers, for all their faults, at least understood that the land was meant to be shared. But then came the Americans with their hunger for gold and their belief that they owned everything they could see. The old man's eyes grew distant as he spoke. I watched as they drove us from our traditional hunting grounds. I saw families separated and children taken to schools where they were forbidden to speak our language. I witnessed the massacre at Apache Pass, where soldiers killed women and children who had come in peace under a flag of truce. Thomas felt a deep shame settling in his stomach. These weren't just stories of distant conflicts. They were the lived experiences of the man sitting across from him. He began to understand why his presence in the camp had caused such tension. But, Manuelito continued, I have also learned that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one it is aimed at. My granddaughters have told me about your behavior in the valley. You showed respect for the land and for them. You offered to share your food and asked for nothing in return. These are not the actions of a man who sees us as less than human. Ayana spoke up softly. Grandfather, he knows things about farming that could help our people. The white man's seeds might grow well in our soil if planted with wisdom. Manuelito studied Thomas intently. Is this true? You would share your knowledge with us? I would be honored to, Thomas replied, but I would also like to learn from you. Your granddaughters showed me how corn, beans, and squash grow together to help each other. I've never seen anything like it. Where I come from, we plant each crop separately. This seemed to please the old man. Knowledge shared makes both people stronger. Knowledge hoarded makes everyone weaker. He paused to throw some tobacco into the fire, watching as the smoke spiraled upward. Tell me about your family, Thomas Mackenzie. What drove you so far from your home? Thomas found himself opening up about his father's death, the struggle to keep the family farm going in Kansas, and his desperate need to find better land. He spoke about his mother and sisters back home, waiting for news of his success or failure. As he talked, he noticed that some of the camp's residents had quietly moved closer to listen. You carry a heavy burden for one so young, Manuelito observed, but perhaps that burden has brought you to where you need to be. He gestured toward the valley below. That land has been calling for someone to tend it properly. Our young people are learning the ways of war because they believe it is the only path to survival. But there is another way, the way of cooperation and mutual respect. The grandfather fell silent for several minutes, staring into the fire as if seeking guidance from the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone of decision. I will make you an offer, Thomas Mackenzie. You may farm in the valley, but not as its owner. The land belongs to the Creator and to all who treat it with respect. You will work alongside our people, sharing your knowledge and learning ours. In return, we will protect you from those who would do you harm, whether they are white or Apache. Thomas felt his heart racing. This was far more than he had hoped for when he first set out from Kansas. I accept your offer with gratitude, he said. But what about the others in your band? Will they accept this arrangement? Manuelito smiled for the first time since they had met. That remains to be seen, but my word still carries weight among our people, and my granddaughters have already spoken in your favor. You must prove yourself through your actions, not your words. Some will watch for any sign that you are like the other white men who have betrayed us. As if summoned by their grandfather's words, several of the younger Apache men approached the fire. Their faces were serious, and Thomas could see skepticism in their eyes. One of them, a warrior with traditional war paint on his face, spoke directly to Thomas in halting English. You say you want peace, but your people kill our families and steal our children. Why should we trust you? Thomas met the man's challenging gaze steadily. Because I am not my people any more than you are responsible for everything every Apache has ever done. I can only answer for my own actions. Judge me by what I do, not by what others who look like me have done. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the young warrior considered this response. The young warrior, whose name was Nalnish, studied Thomas for a long moment before responding. Words are easy to speak when you are surrounded by our protection, he said coldly. But what will you do when soldiers come looking for Apache to kill? Will you stand with us or with them? Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the camp upon him. This was clearly a test, and his answer would determine whether he would ever truly be accepted among these people. He thought of his family back in Kansas, of the life he had left behind, and of the new life he was trying to build. If soldiers come seeking to harm innocent people, I will stand against them, he said firmly. I came here seeking land to farm, not to participate in war. But I will not stand by and watch helpless people be slaughtered regardless of their race. Nalnish's stern expression softened slightly, but he wasn't finished. And what of your government's laws? They say it is illegal to help Apache people. Your own law calls us enemies. Thomas had not considered this complication, but he found his answer came from his heart rather than his head. I believe there is a higher law than any government's law, the law of human decency. I would rather break an unjust law than break my conscience. Manuelito nodded approvingly at this response, and Thomas saw several other Apache faces lose some of their suspicion. But Nalish had one more challenge. Prove your words, the warrior said. There is a family hiding in the caves near Black Rock. They are refugees from the attack on their village 2 weeks ago. They have children who are hungry and wounded. If you truly wish to help our people, go with Ayana and bring them food and medicine. But know that soldiers patrol that area. If you are caught helping Apache people, you could be hanged as a traitor. The camp fell completely silent. Thomas realized that this was more than just a test of his sincerity. It was a test of his courage and commitment. Everything he had said about standing with the Apache people would be meaningless if he wasn't willing to take real risks to help them. I'll go, he said without hesitation. When do we leave? Ayana looked surprised but pleased. We should wait until nightfall, she said. The soldiers usually make camp at sunset and do not patrol in the darkness. We can reach the caves and return before dawn. The rest of the afternoon was spent in preparation. Thomas was given traditional Apache clothing to help him blend in with the landscape, and he was taught some basic Apache words that might be useful if they encountered other band members. Kiona prepared a pack of dried meat, cornmeal, and medicinal herbs, while Nayeli gathered blankets and other supplies for the refugee family. As the sun began to set, Manuelito pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. You are about to take a step that will change your life forever, the old man said seriously. Once you help Apache people against the soldiers, you will be marked as an enemy by your own government. There will be no going back to the life you knew before. Thomas had already considered this, but hearing it stated so plainly made the reality sink in more deeply. I understand, he said. But I've already seen enough to know that I can't live with myself if I turn away from people who need help. Good, Manuelito replied. That is what I hoped you would say. But remember, courage without wisdom gets people killed. Listen to Ayana tonight. She knows these mountains better than anyone, and she has evaded soldier patrols many times before. As darkness fell, Thomas and Ayana set out from the camp on foot. They moved silently through the mountain trails with Ayana leading the way, and Thomas following her example and placing his feet carefully to avoid making noise. The weight of the supply pack on his back reminded him with every step of the commitment he was making. They traveled for several hours through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without an experienced guide. Ayana seemed to know exactly where every loose rock and low branch was located, even in the darkness. She communicated primarily through hand signals, only occasionally whispering warnings about obstacles or changes in direction. Around midnight, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley where the refugee family was supposed to be hiding. Ayana motioned for Thomas to stay low as she scouted ahead. When she returned, her face was grim. Soldiers, she whispered. They are camped near the caves. The family must still be hiding, but we cannot reach them without being seen. Thomas felt his heart sink. They had come so far, and the supplies they carried could mean the difference between life and death for hungry children. But attempting to reach the caves with soldiers nearby would be suicidal. Is there another way? He asked quietly. Ayana considered this for several minutes. "There is a path that leads around the back of the ridge," she finally said. "But it is very dangerous. One wrong step and you fall to your death. Even in daylight, it is treacherous." Thomas weighed their options. They could return to camp and try again another night, but every day of delay meant more suffering for the refugee family. Or they could attempt the dangerous path in darkness, risking their own lives to help others. "I'll try it," he decided. "You know these mountains better than I do. If you think we can make it, then I trust your judgment." Ayana looked at him with what might have been admiration. "You are either very brave or very foolish," she said. "Perhaps both. Come, we must move carefully." The path she led him to was barely worthy of the name. It was little more than a narrow ledge that wound around the face of a steep cliff. In the darkness, Thomas could not see how far the drop was below them, which was probably a mercy. He focused entirely on placing his feet exactly where Ayana had stepped and tried not to think about the consequences of a mistake. Several times, loose rocks broke away under their feet and clattered down the mountainside. Each time they froze and listened for any sign that the soldiers had heard. But the wind in the canyon seemed to carry the sounds away from the military camp. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they reached a narrow opening in the rock face. Ayana made a soft call that sounded like a night bird, and after a moment, it was answered from somewhere in the darkness ahead. They made their way deeper into the cave system until they reached a chamber where a small fire provided dim light. Thomas's first sight of the refugee family broke his heart. There were 2 adults, a man and woman who looked to be in their 30s, and 3 children ranging from about 5 to 12 years old. All of them were thin and hollow-eyed from hunger and exhaustion. The adults initially recoiled in fear when they saw Thomas, but Ayana quickly explained his presence in Apache. The man, whose name was Goyathle, had been wounded in the leg during the attack on their village and could barely walk. His wife Desba was trying to care for him and their 3 children with almost no supplies. Thomas and Ayana immediately set about distributing the food and medical supplies they had brought. Ayana cleaned and dressed Goyathle's wound, while Thomas helped Desba prepare a meal for the children. The gratitude in their eyes was overwhelming, and Thomas felt more purpose in that moment than he had ever felt while working his family's farm in Kansas. The youngest child, a girl of about 5 with enormous dark eyes, approached Thomas shyly while her parents were distracted with the medical attention. She stared up at him with curious wonder and reached out to touch his pale skin with her tiny finger. When he smiled at her, she giggled and ran back to her mother. "She has never seen a white man who was not wearing a uniform," Desba explained in broken English. To her, white skin meant danger and death. "But you bring food and kindness." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. The innocence of the child's curiosity stood in stark contrast to the violence and hatred that had shaped her short life. He realized that his actions tonight might be among her first positive memories involving someone who looked like him. Goyathle, despite his pain, insisted on sharing what little he knew about recent military movements in the area. "More soldiers are coming from the fort," he warned. "They seek all Apache people, not just warriors. They want to force everyone onto the reservation, even the children and elders who have never fought anyone." This information troubled Thomas deeply. He had assumed that the conflicts were primarily between military forces and Apache warriors. The idea that innocent families were being hunted simply for existing in their traditional homeland seemed both cruel and senseless. As Ayana finished tending to Goyathle's wound, she and Thomas discussed the family's options. The cave provided temporary shelter, but it was not a long-term solution. The children needed regular meals and medical care, and winter was approaching rapidly in the mountains. "They could come to our band," Ayana suggested, "but the journey would be dangerous for someone with a wounded leg, and more people in our camp means less food for everyone." Thomas thought about his wagon and supplies hidden in the valley below. "What if I brought my wagon up? We could move them during the day when the soldiers are likely to be elsewhere." "Too risky," Ayana replied immediately. "The sound of wagon wheels on these mountain paths would carry for miles. And if soldiers found your wagon, they would know that someone was helping Apache people." As they discussed alternatives, the eldest child, a boy of about 12 named Naiche, spoke up. "I could make it to the reservation on my own," he said in Apache, which Ayana translated for Thomas. "I am strong and know the paths. If I go there and tell them my family is dead, they will stop looking for us. Desba immediately rejected this idea with fierce determination. I will not be separated from my children, she said firmly. We stay together, whatever happens. Thomas admired the family's loyalty to each other, but he could see that their situation was becoming desperate. Goyathle's wound was serious enough that infection could set in without proper treatment. The younger children were already showing signs of malnutrition, and the approaching winter would make survival in the caves nearly impossible. After much discussion, they developed a plan that would require careful coordination and significant risk. Thomas would return to the valley and prepare a hidden shelter near his farming site. Over the next several nights, he and Ayana would gradually move supplies to create a secret refuge where the family could recover in safety. Once Goyathle's leg had healed sufficiently, they could decide whether to try reaching Manuelito's band or attempt to find sanctuary elsewhere. As dawn approached, Thomas and Ayana prepared to leave. The family expressed their gratitude with words and gestures that transcended language barriers. Even the shy 5-year-old came forward to give Thomas a small carved wooden bird that she had been clutching throughout the night. The return journey to Manuelito's camp was made more difficult by exhaustion and the growing daylight. They had to take several detours to avoid areas where soldiers might be patrolling, adding hours to their travel time. By the time they reached safety, both Thomas and Ayana were pushed to their physical limits. Manuelito was waiting for them when they arrived, almost as if he had sensed that they would need his guidance. He listened carefully to their report about the refugee family and the increasing military presence in the area. You have taken the first step on a path that will lead you far from the life you once knew, the old man told Thomas. But it is a good path, one that honors both your people and mine. However, the challenges ahead will be greater than anything you faced last night. Over the following days, Thomas threw himself into the work of preparing a hidden refuge for the family. With help from several of the Apache men who had begun to accept him, he constructed a concealed shelter using traditional building techniques that would be invisible to casual observation. They dug a root cellar for storing food and created a hidden water source by diverting a small stream. During this time, Thomas also began learning more about Apache culture and traditions. He discovered that their agricultural knowledge was far more sophisticated than he had initially realized. They had developed drought-resistant varieties of corn and beans that could thrive in the harsh mountain environment. Their understanding of plant breeding and soil management rivaled anything he had learned from European farming traditions. In return, Thomas shared his knowledge of metal tools and European farming techniques that could complement Apache methods. He showed them how to build more efficient plows and demonstrated techniques for preserving seeds through harsh winters. The exchange of knowledge flowed both ways, creating bonds of mutual respect and friendship. But their peaceful work was interrupted by disturbing news brought by Apache scouts. A large military expedition was being organized at the nearest fort, with the stated goal of clearing all Apache people from the region. The commanding officer had reportedly declared that any white settlers found to be assisting Apache people would be treated as enemy combatants. This news created a crisis for Thomas. His presence in the Apache camp was no longer just risky. It was potentially fatal for everyone involved. If soldiers discovered that he was working with Manuelito's band, the entire community could be targeted for destruction. Nalnish, the young warrior who had initially challenged Thomas, now approached him with grudging respect. You have proven your courage and your commitment to our people, he said. But now your presence here puts all of us in danger. You must decide whether to flee to safety or stay and face whatever comes. Thomas looked around at the people who had become his friends and allies over the past weeks. He thought about the refugee family still hiding in the caves, depending on his help for their survival. He considered his original dream of farming in the peaceful valley and realized that dream had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. I'm staying, he said without hesitation. We'll face whatever comes together. The decision made, the entire band began preparing for the possibility of military attack. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, escape routes were planned, and supplies were hidden in various locations throughout the mountains. Thomas found himself being trained in Apache fighting techniques and guerrilla warfare tactics that he never could have imagined learning when he left Kansas. 3 weeks after Thomas made his decision to stay, the anticipated military expedition arrived in the valley. The sound of horses and wagon wheels echoed off the canyon walls as nearly 50 soldiers established a base camp near the stream, where Thomas had first met Ayanna and her sisters. From their hidden observation posts in the mountains above, the Apache scouts counted the soldiers and assessed their equipment and intentions. Captain Morrison, the commanding officer, was a career military man with a reputation for ruthlessness in dealing with Native Americans. He had brought not only soldiers, but also Apache trackers who had been forced to work for the army, along with a civilian guide who claimed to know the location of every Apache band in the region. Thomas felt a sick feeling in his stomach when he realized that his wagon and farming equipment were still hidden near the stream. If the soldiers found them, they would know that a white settler had been in the area recently. The discovery could lead to a thorough search of the mountains that would eventually uncover not only Manuelito's band, but also the refugee family still hiding in the caves. "We have to get my wagon," Thomas told Ayanna urgently. "If they find it, they'll know someone has been helping you." Ayanna shook her head. "Too dangerous. They have guards posted all around their camp. Anyone who approaches will be seen and shot." But Manuelito, who had been listening to their conversation, surprised them both with his response. "Perhaps it is time to use the wagon for a different purpose, Nye," the old man said thoughtfully. "Thomas, you are still a white man. If you appeared in their camp with a story about being attacked by Apache raiders, they might believe you." The audacious plan that Manuelito proposed was risky beyond belief, but it offered the possibility of not only recovering Thomas's wagon, but also gathering vital intelligence about the military expedition's plans. Thomas would pose as a settler who had barely escaped an Apache attack, seeking the army's protection while secretly working to protect the very people he was supposed to fear. Thomas spent hours practicing his cover story with Ayanna's help. They created fake evidence of an Apache attack, including arrows shot into his wagon and scattered supplies that would suggest a hasty retreat. Ayanna even gave him a minor but realistic-looking wound on his arm to support his story of barely escaping with his life. As dawn broke the next morning, Thomas drove his wagon down into the valley, playing the part of a traumatized settler seeking military protection. The soldiers who challenged him at their perimeter were immediately sympathetic to his apparent plight. "Thank God you made it," one of the sentries said as he escorted Thomas to Captain Morrison's tent. "We've been hearing reports of increased Apache activity in this area. You're lucky to be alive." Captain Morrison was a stern-faced man in his 50s with cold gray eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of military advantage. He listened to Thomas's fabricated story of an Apache attack with professional interest, asking detailed questions about the number of warriors involved and their apparent direction of travel. "You're fortunate that we arrived when we did," Morrison said when Thomas finished his tale. "This entire region is crawling with hostile Apache bands. We're here to clear them out permanently and make it safe for decent settlers like yourself." Thomas had to fight to keep his expression neutral as Morrison described his plans for the Apache people with casual brutality. The captain spoke of burning villages, destroying food supplies, and forcing all Apache people onto reservations where they could be properly controlled. He showed Thomas a map marking the locations of suspected Apache camps, including one that was uncomfortably close to where Goyathle's family was hiding. "We'll start with the smaller bands and work our way up to the main groups," Morrison explained. "The key is to eliminate their ability to find food and shelter in these mountains. Once they're starving and desperate, they'll surrender peacefully enough." Thomas managed to express appropriate enthusiasm for these plans, while mentally calculating how much warning he could provide to the various Apache communities. He volunteered to serve as a guide for the soldiers, claiming detailed knowledge of the local terrain that would help them track down hostile bands. Over the following days, Thomas walked a precarious tightrope between maintaining his cover and protecting the people he had come to care about. He led military patrols away from areas where he knew Apache families were hiding, while providing just enough genuine information to maintain Morrison's trust. When soldiers found evidence of Apache presence in areas that had already been evacuated, Thomas received praise for his tracking abilities. The most dangerous moment came when a patrol discovered the caves where Goyathle's family had been hiding. Fortunately, Thomas had managed to move them to the secret shelter near his farming site several nights earlier, but the soldiers found clear evidence that the caves had been recently occupied. "This is perfect," Morrison said with satisfaction as he examined the abandoned campfire and other signs of habitation. We're getting close to them. They're running out of places to hide. Thomas had to stand there and nod approvingly while knowing that a family with young children had narrowly escaped what would likely have been a massacre. The stress of maintaining his deception while watching soldiers plan the destruction of innocent people was taking a severe toll on his mental state. Meanwhile, his nighttime activities continued in secret. Using his access to military intelligence, Thomas was able to warn Manuelito's band about planned patrol routes and search areas. The Apache people proved remarkably adaptable, moving their camps and adjusting their patterns of movement to stay one step ahead of the military forces. Ayana had taken to meeting Thomas at predetermined locations in the darkness, where they would share information and coordinate the ongoing effort to protect Apache families. During one of these meetings, she brought news that changed everything. More bands are coming together, she reported. Word has spread about what you have done to help our people. Warriors from different groups want to meet the white man who risks his life for Apache children. Thomas felt overwhelmed by this development. His simple desire to farm in a peaceful valley had somehow evolved into a role as a bridge between two cultures at war. The responsibility was enormous, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic for everyone involved. The situation reached a crisis point when Morrison announced plans for a massive coordinated attack on what military intelligence believed was the location of Manuelito's main camp. The soldiers had been gathering information from various sources and had identified a hidden valley that matched the description of the Apache stronghold. Thomas realized with horror that they were planning to attack the very place where he had first encountered the three sisters, the beautiful valley that had seemed like paradise when he first discovered it. Morrison intended to surround the area with soldiers and attack at dawn, expecting to catch the Apache people while they were sleeping and vulnerable. That night, Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his life. Warning the Apache people about the planned attack would almost certainly expose his true loyalties and result in his execution as a traitor. But remaining silent would mean the massacre of dozens of innocent people, including children and elders who had never harmed anyone. As he sat in his tent listening to the soldiers making final preparations for their dawn assault, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered his father's dying words about making something of himself where others feared to go. He thought about the 5-year-old Apache girl who had given him a carved wooden bird, and about Ayana's courage in trusting a stranger with her people's lives. When the camp finally settled into quiet preparation for the pre-dawn march, Thomas made his choice. He slipped out of his tent and into the darkness, knowing that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. By morning, he would either be a hero to the Apache people and a wanted fugitive to his own government, or he would be dead. But he could live with either of those outcomes better than he could live with the alternative of doing nothing while innocent people were slaughtered. The stars above seemed unusually bright as Thomas made his way through the darkness toward what he now knew was his true destiny. He was no longer just a farmer seeking land. He had become something he never expected to be. A bridge between worlds, a man whose choices would ripple through history long after his own story ended.